people in as if they arrive? Yeah, great. So if you've just arrived, welcome. This is the launch of issue 110 of Source, which you possibly have seen already, but this is a copy here. And tonight we'll be talking to a contributor to this issue. I should mention a couple of things to start us off. We'll be recording this chat. So if you miss anything, we'll later post it on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and you can catch up and rewatch it if we say something so interesting that you want to hear it again. So as I said, I'll be talking to one of the contributors from this issue. I should say a few things just before we get going. I should say some thanks to our funders, so Belfast City Council and the Arts Council of Northern Ireland and the Arts Council of Ireland. And I should also thank our partner for this event, Photo Museum Ireland, who have helped us with the hosting of this launch, as they have previous launches. Tonight we're going to talk to Morwenna Kearsley, who has a portfolio in this issue, but I should tell you a little bit more about what else is in this issue. It's the knowledge themed issue. We have three terrific portfolios. Alan Butler has made cyanotypes from stills from computer games in his virtual botany cyanotypes. And so it is a strangely monotone portfolio section, which makes it sound less interesting, but actually it turns out to be very colorful. And we also have a selection of historic images by John Hardy Wilson, his teaching slide collection, which makes it sound maybe a little bit pedagogical, but it turns out to be really, really weird pictures of funguses and other things that are surprising and quite exciting, brilliantly introduced by Nora Labo. And the third portfolio is by Morwenna, who I'm going to be talking to in a second. Here's an immediate glimpse of what we're going to be talking about. Also in this issue is, on the subject of knowledge, is a great essay about travel photography by Sarah Dominici, called Wish You Were Here, and some fascinating conversations about scientific imagery with some very strange electron scanning microscope pictures, and a great interview with a photomicroscopist. And I rehearsed saying photomicroscopist before I started this, and I'm glad I did. And also in the review section, there's a fascinating, long, extended review of a roundup of recent books of American landscape photography, including the Alex Soth book that came out last year, Pound of Pictures, and the Karen Hattelberg, River's Dream, and the Stacey Kranitz book, which I think is particularly fascinating and I'd recommend. Along with so much more, because obviously that's just a glimpse of what's in the 88 pages of this issue, a particularly wide-ranging issue. Knowledge is a great subject for a magazine, as we discovered as we developed it. There's so much material that could have gone into this issue. We're going to talk to Morwenna. I should mention that we're going to talk a little bit about the Writers' Prize, because as well as being a contributor to the portfolio section, Morwenna is also a contributor as a writer to the magazine, and first got in contact with me as a contributor to the Writers' Prize. And I should mention that we're going to be doing the Writers' Prize again this year, and if you want to contribute, then please do. The details are on our website. And on the subject of opportunities, we'll also be hosting a portfolio review day if you want to contribute some work to the magazine. And my co-editor, John, is standing by and can tell us a little bit about that. John, would you like to say something about the portfolio review day?
Sure. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, we'll be hosting an event for photographers to show us work for consideration for future issues on Friday, the 9th of June, and this is via Zoom, so it's open to anybody based in the UK or Ireland, or anybody making work there. And the full details are on the website, but the deadline for submissions to that is the 5th of May. It's quite an easy process, just to email us a PDF with some images and a little bit of background text. We've been hosting this kind of event since 1997, and it's one of the main ways that it's a way that we find work for future issues of the magazine. It's free at all points. And I look at all the work that comes in and enjoy doing so. So even if I don't get to meet up with you on the day, it's a useful way for you to introduce your work. In terms of what we're looking for, it's quite a broad church at Source. We publish a wide range of work across documentary, more conceptual practice. If you want an indication of the kind of work that we have published, website is a good place to look, and you can search through that by artist and see the type of portfolios we've published in the past. But in general, we're looking for personal projects that might not have seen the light of day otherwise. So full details are on the website, but if you have some work bubbling away in the background, then please do get in touch and consider letting us see some of it. And I'll pass you back to Richard.
Great. Thanks very much, John. So I've already mentioned Morwenna Kearsley is a writer and artist, and her portfolio Notch Code is in the current issue. But I first came across Morwenna she first contacted me through submitting a piece for the Writers' Prize 3 years ago, I think. And we published that work, that piece, as one of the runners-up for the Writers' Prize, and she's subsequently written reviews for us. So Morwenna, I thought maybe we'd start a little bit by talking about the process of writing. So that piece was about a photograph by Brassai. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself as a writer?
Yeah, hello. It's really nice to be here, and thank you for publishing the work. So yeah, writing. So I first got in contact with you about the Writers' Prize, and that first essay I wrote, it didn't get a runner-up or anything, but it started a conversation. So I applied again the next year. And the essay that we're talking about is called Black Cats, and I actually wrote that specifically for the Source Writing Prize. And it was because I started it because I had been reading Jeffrey Batchen's book Negative Positive, which I found out about in Source, and that talks, broadly, that book talks about the negative as a kind of foundational element of analog photography. So I was thinking about those two sides, negative, positive, light, dark, and yeah, that's where the story had come from. Writing is obviously a completely different process to the process I use for making photographs. It's much more kind of analytical in the moment. I think when I make photographs, I'm just working quite instinctively, and then I'm kind of assigning meaning to it later. Whereas writing, you're, faced with a blank page and you're trying to kind of structure something and make meaning in the moment.
So how do you get going on when you have an idea, or what is it that starts you writing something? I mean, one of the things about the Writers' Prize is that it's sort of open-ended, because we want people to show us different ways of approaching subjects, and they don't necessarily have to write something in a standard format like a review or an interview or something like that. So, and you particularly write in a sort of discursive way where you draw in lots of different things. How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, so like I said to you before, I mean, I find writing extraordinarily difficult, and it doesn't come easy to me. And so one way to kind of begin and to start, and I've been doing it way back ever since I was a student, it's how I used to keep sketchbooks, but I start by thinking through and writing and describing the rituals associated with the different processes in photography. So sometimes it can be describing processing negatives. Sometimes it can be describing the actions involved as you make a print in the darkroom. And that kind of unlocks something for me to be able to kind of link that action or that set of actions to a photograph or a film or a book, something like that, that then once you can find that one thing to tie on to the process, then other avenues seem to open up. And so, yeah, that's kind of the way that I always approach writing now.
Yeah. So in a way, it's sort of connected with what you do when maybe with the way you're thinking about things for your own photographic practice. They're parallel paths.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I notice I'm wearing a black cat t-shirt. This is surely a brilliant coincidence. But
Wow.
maybe you should start by showing some of the pictures that you were talking about. Can you see that okay?
Yep, I can see it.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the black cat that's your essay was about. Can you tell us a little bit about this and where you came across it?
Yeah, so in the story, it's in the essay that I wrote, that the story is a part of the essay. I've loved this picture for a long time. I can't remember when I first came across it, probably in an anthology of photography book. And I like it because it's kind of mysterious. It is a photograph, but you're not, I mean, I wasn't sure if it was the first time I looked at it. It could be an etching or a sketch. So then a few years, but just before COVID, I was in Amsterdam at Unseen Festival. I think it was Foam museum I was in, and I picked up a postcard of the black cat and had it on my mantelpiece and was kind of just really drawn to it, wanted to write something about it. And then, like I said, those kind of elements all came together, the application to the Writers' Prize, the thinking about negative and positive, and that postcard. And what had intrigued me about it for so long was how is it made? Because it just like, there's so many things that don't quite add up. So I had photographed it, rephotographed it, put it into Photoshop and inverted it to kind of get closer to its negative state. And when you do that, I think you can see that there's been a lot of manipulation to the negative, which I really enjoyed, and it felt like a little kind of reveal. And so the kind of story progressed from there.
Yeah, so there's when you sent in the piece, you also included this inverted version of the image, which is sort of even more weird than the than the original picture.
That's great.
Yeah, it's almost like an X-ray. It becomes almost like an X-ray.
Yeah, and when I was thinking, okay, what stories can I think of that have either had cats involved or that have a kind of like mystical or like gothic sensibility, and like obviously the main man is Edgar Allan Poe, and there's an amazing independent bookshop just down the road from me in Glasgow, and I went in and was speaking to him, and he said, here's a book of short stories by Poe, I'm sure there's a cat story in there. So I reread Black Cat, and then it just kind of, it really works, that story, for thinking about photography, particularly this interplay of negative and positive.
I should mention, of course, that people can read this piece that we're talking about on our website among the other Writers' Prize submissions. So if you want to go and have a read of what we're talking about after we finish talking, then you can do that. So there's you draw in with this. You've mentioned Poe, but you also draw in other references, like you talk about Pluto, sort of god of the underworld. And are these things that you're always thinking about, that are just part of the way you think about photography, or did you kind of discover these things?
Yeah, I think like my approach to photography, similar to a lot of people, is I take inspiration from lots of different places, not just photography, although I am very interested and informed by the history of this particular medium. I'm constantly looking at film and painting, and I read a lot. And so whatever it is that's kind of in my field of vision at that time, it tends to show up in whatever it is that I'm making. So yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
I forgot the original question. Yes.
No, I was thinking about the reference to Pluto, but it's
sorry. Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, I'll go back to that. So, yeah, I mean, I would not like to give the impression that I am particularly knowledgeable about classics or anything like that. It was more thinking about this idea of like someone in the dark room and printing away, and kind of not just printing pictures, but actually being able to kind of influence what was happening on Earth, like kind of, I don't know, like a Ray Harryhausen film or something. You know, you got like the gods up there playing with the humans. That was kind of in my mind when I was thinking about it. And then I probably just spent a bit of time on Wikipedia or Google finding out how that all links up to Proserpina.
Yeah. So since you submitted that piece, we've been in touch, and after you did that, we had a chat, and I was asking you about similar questions to the questions I'm asking you now about the things that interested you. And since then, you've written some reviews for us. And it's always an interesting process for me to think of, I talk to a writer and they tell me what they're interested in. And then a book turns up and I think, oh, that would be perfect for Morwenna. And lo and behold, this book, Photography as Motif, which you sent me a picture of, which I forgot to include here. So we won't be looking at it. But anyway, it's just the cover of the book. But this book and other book that you reviewed before that, and a book that you're reviewing for a future issue, how do you find the process of writing a review as against writing the sort of open-ended piece that you submitted before?
Yeah, well, they're for me, they're completely different processes. Again, like, there's much more kind of responsibility, I feel, when I'm writing a book review. When I'm writing my own kind of essays, or what I see as like a kind of creative writing process, there aren't any rules, and I can just write whatever it is I'm thinking about. And obviously I edit it down before I send it out to anyone. But with a book review, you have the responsibility to the person you're writing the book review for, their audience, and also the author of the book. So I think I need to be much more focused in my thinking. And to write a book review, again, I find it's so difficult, and I love the challenge, because you're taking something that's quite large and complex. It doesn't matter whether it's a book with 25 pages or 200 pages. There's so many ideas in every book, and you've got to take those ideas, kind of filter it through your own experience of the world, and then write something really clear and concise that has obviously a bit of like your opinion of it, but that's also got like some amount of objectivity as well.
Yeah. But you don't find it constraining, I suppose, is one thing. I sometimes worry that there's a very practical function to a book review, that you want to be able to tell the reader something about what the book is. In all likelihood, people aren't going to see the book, especially if it's quite a niche area, but they might be interested in it enough to find out about it. But you don't find it too constraining having to fulfill these sort of duties to the reader?
Not at all. It's like absolutely brilliant to get these books through the post, number one. And number two, I like working to a kind of a limitation, and it is a real challenge to, you know, particularly the ones that are like 280 words. You start writing thinking, oh, that's quite a lot of words, but then actually the difficulty is in editing them down, and then obviously you edit them again, which clarifies everything. But it's a similar process. That part of it is a similar process to how most photographers work, in that you make lots of pictures, lots of work, and then really the meaning making part is in the editing, like choosing which image goes next to which image. And that's about reducing and reducing and reducing and trying to be concise, which, you know, there's a link there to the book review process as well.
Yeah. So we were talking, when I talked to you, and when we subsequently talked about Notch Code, which is the work we're going to be talking about here, you were talking about some of the things, the activities that you've been undertaking. You remember you talking about you were photographing objects, and you were particularly interested in things like framing and the backdrops to objects. And I remember you talking about Fox Talbot. Is this because you're terrifically erudite and you're constantly drawing on the history of photography, or what is it that drew you to this picture in particular?
That's it in a nutshell, Richard. Well, initially when I was talking to you, I remember rambling on at length about all the things I was interested in. And at the time I'd spoken to you, I just finished making a series of work that actually I've spent the last few years doing, and I still am doing, which is essentially to photograph fabric. And I think we'll talk about the way I photograph a wee bit later on, but it's quite a specific way that I'm making the pictures. And I just got like really, really obsessed with making pictures of fabric, looking at how light is absorbed and then reflected. And at the same time, looking again at still life. I love still life, always love still life. And this Fox Talbot work, I mean, I was shown this work, I must have been shown this work on my undergrad early on, and it's in all the different anthologies of photography. I am interested in the history of the medium, very much so. But also there was a show of Cornelia Parker's work at Pollock House 3-4 years ago, and it takes as its starting point this image. So it kind of reminded me of that work again, and I went back to look at it. And there's so many things that interest me about this work. Is two things that I would mention that relate to notch code. One is the objects themselves and the way that they are placed on a shelf, and they've kind of almost like assume little characters to my mind anyway. And I like the way that the photograph is like ultimately in its composition, like incredibly simple. We're just looking at it straight on. And then the other thing is that Fox Talbot is obviously well known for introducing the calotype to the world. And a lot of these techniques used contact print, so they weren't enlarging. It was in this case a salted paper negative that sits up next to salted paper, and so it's a kind of like transferal of negative to positive that really intrigued me, and that's kind of how I knew I was going to make contact prints of notch code, not enlargements.
What was the Cornelia Parker connection?
Oh, so I can't remember the name. She's got this beautiful work that she took Fox Talbot's actual original glass pieces, which are in a museum, and she used the photogravure technique, which I think maybe he also helped develop or invented. And she made all these beautiful photogravures of the shadows that these glass pieces cast onto photosensitive paper. Yeah, it's really nice work. Yeah. So
you've paired these. I've paired these pictures here, but we also talked about Citizen Kane in relation to this, and there's something about the objectness of stuff here, and something that I'm sure we'll come on to talking about notch code is the sort of personalities of individual images and the meaning that is given to objects in people's lives. So what did this still from Citizen Kane mean to you?
So Citizen Kane is a film that I think I seen the first time when I was studying, again, in my early 20s, and I've just watched regularly ever since then. I've seen it a lot. And again, there's like two main things about this source of inspiration. The first is, as I believe it's like one of the first instances in film history of deep focus. So there's multiple narratives going on in the foreground and the background, and you as the viewer are you're able to see and understand all these different narratives. And in the photographs I shot, you can't really tell from the prints, but it's using it's also using deep focus. You can see all the way to the back. Actually, you can see the kind of the weft and weave of the fabric quite clearly. But actually, the reason that I'm so interested in Citizen Kane when I'm thinking about Notch Code is that for those that don't know the story, basically the story of the film is a reporter, like a journalist, is sent to kind of unravel the meaning or the mystery behind the dying words of this like super famous news tycoon. He's kind of like a Murdoch or like Trump-like figure. And he says the word rosebud just before he dies. So they're trying to figure out what it meant. They think this must have some great meaning. And so what the journalist is he goes around all the people in Citizen Kane's life, and they're all telling him stories about Citizen Kane. So he tries to make up this kind of self-portrait from the conversations he's been having. And that's what he's trying to do. And that linked to a quote by the writer Borges that is also thinking about using objects to make up a self-portrait. And that's really like kind of at the root of what Notch Code is.
Yeah. So, okay, this is the first picture we're going to show from Notch Code. And already we've got the title and the object. So can you tell us a little bit what we can see and how it was made?
Yeah, so this was the very first one that I made. And like I said before, I am envious of photographers that do, but I am not able to start a project knowing exactly what I'm doing when I'm doing it. I tend to work really instinctively, and then I kind of review what I'm doing as I go along. So this one, it was lockdown. In Glasgow, we were in lockdown for a long time, and we weren't allowed to travel more than 5 miles, but my studio was within that radius. So I was going to the studio. My studio that I share with my partner is just full of rubbish objects, just stuff that we collect and never throw out. So I was starting to sift through these objects with Citizen Kane in mind, with Fox Talbot in mind, with fabric in mind. And one of the first things that I kind of pulled out was this piece of insulation material. There was a bag of these pieces of insulation material in the studio, and it reminded me of Citizen Kane. There's a shot where you see his gate posts. It reminded me of that, and I thought, I wonder how that would look as a photograph. So I placed it in the black velvet, and I use I don't use any conventional lighting techniques at all. I've been using this technique for a while. I basically, ages ago, I was watching a video of Kit Weston, who is Edward Weston's, I think, great nephew or something like that. And he is on YouTube, and he's in Edward Weston's old cabin, and he's talking about all his techniques and the way he made his still lives, particularly Pepper Number 30. And in the video, he talks about how Weston made a tiny, tiny aperture, really, really small, almost like a pinhole. And because of that, he needed a really long exposure. And his long exposures were, 4 to 6 hours, something like that, a long time. And because it's California, you have sunlight moving around the room, bouncing around the room all the time. So I thought, I want to try that because I love Pepper Number 30 in particular. But we're in Scotland, we don't have as much sunlight. So I decided to, again, invert the technique. So instead of a nice bright room, I use a pitch black room. I black everything out. And I use, instead of the sun, I use a moving torch. And these are exposures of around about 8 minutes, something like that. And because of that, you can start to see the light leaks. I deliberately dropped a dark slide and I knew it had a crack in it, but I wasn't sure exactly where the crack was. My way of making pictures, I have an all right technical knowledge, and so I'm in control. And then I like to leave something in the making that I'm not entirely in control of. So there's a kind of like moment of revelation that's what I'm looking to feel when I'm making work that I think is successful. And this was the first image that came out, and I thought it had something to it that I wanted to explore further.
Mm. It's interesting talking to photographers about the moment at which they make an exposure and whether or not the act of photography is in itself a kind of a process that they're engaged with. And for some people, it's all the setting up the picture. But your description of having 8 minutes in which you're moving around with a torch makes it sound like a very, the making of the exposure is a very active process.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something quite kind of reverential about it. Like you're choosing something. In the case of notch code, it's pieces of junk mainly, or broken objects. But actually, by spotlighting it in that way, the way that I look at the object changes. And it's a really fulfilling way for me to make still life. And that time where I'm shining the light, I mean, sometimes I'm just, thinking of what I'm going to have for tea, but sometimes I'm actually thinking about, okay, like if this neg comes out the way I want it, how am I going to print it? And I'm thinking forwards in time with the negative.
The other thing that's interesting about these pictures is that you're shooting them on a very large negative, and you're using a process that is normally reserved for a situation where you want absolute precision. And yet there are some sort of there are faults in a standard sense in the picture. And when we were talking about this, you referred to another image, which I can show you here. Can you tell us a little bit about this and how it's factored into your thinking?
So when you look at notch code, like particularly, maybe not so much in the magazine, I may have like cleaned it up a little bit, but if you're looking at my original prints, there are lots of mistakes that I left in on purpose. So by mistakes, I mean that there's like scratches, there's little things where the neg isn't quite aligned, there's a slight unevenness in the print on a couple of them. And I left them in because I felt like they were like part of like the spirit of the image, but also they spoke a little bit to the circumstances I was in a studio during lockdown, trying to kind of make the best out of the equipment I have. Not in Scotland, we've got 2 great photo galleries that you can go and make work in that are nice and clean. My studio's quite messy. So yeah, there was lots of things happening to the negs that normally wouldn't. But also when you leave in these kind of mistakes, the viewer becomes aware that they're looking at a photograph. You don't just kind of melt into the print. You're aware, okay, we're actually looking at a photograph. So this image is by Brancusi, who was a sculptor, and I love his photographs. And just to keep things brief, so basically he was pals with Man Ray because they were both living in Paris at the same time. And Man Ray wrote quite a lot about Brancusi's approach to photography. So apparently he knew Steichen and Stieglitz, the big boys of photography, and they had both photographed his work, and he was apparently unhappy with the photographs because they were too perfect. Those photographers were too technically great, and he felt like something was lost. So Man Ray taught him like the basics of photography and darkroom printing. And Brancusi made his own pictures. And what he was looking for was a photograph where the kind of aura or the meaning or the spirit of the original artwork came through in the photography. And often that came from scratches, from a glare of light like we see in this one, or some like rough printing. And that appeals to me, that approach.
So if we pair this with instrument, which is also from notch code, this in particular is that sort of fogging around the corner? Can you say what's going on in this picture?
I don't know. No, I do know. This was from a dark slide, like I told you, that had been dropped, and I think maybe it's because it's a metal tin can. There's more light reflecting off it. But what you can see, it's it's not fogging, it's light trails, and the light trails have got in through the broken dark slide. And you can kind of see the light pinging around. And, you know, when we, like, anyone who teaches like an intro photography course, particularly darkroom, you can start out by describing photography as a relationship between light and time. And at its most basic, that's what it is. And I guess there was like, I wasn't doing it consciously at the time, but when I look at some of the images of notch code, they're starting to like edge towards speaking about that. You can see the light, and you can see the light because of the time aspect as well.
Could you say a little bit about, we move on to another image here, Labyrinth. Can you just tell us a little bit what notch code refers to?
Yeah, so what you're looking at in the magazine, and if you see the prints, is their contact prints. So I talked about it before. So the negative that I'm shooting on is called a 5x4 or 4x5 negative. And you take the negative and then you place it onto photosensitive paper, photographic paper in the darkroom. So another artist had written an essay about this, and she talked about the contact print as an image that kind of makes itself, makes an image of itself, which I really liked. So one of the reasons I wanted to keep to just using contact prints was you can see the notch code. So the notch code is in the top left-hand corner if you're looking at the screen. And it's like these little ridges like this. And what they're for is if you send them to a laboratory or something like that, film has to be handled in the pitch dark because it's sensitive to the full spectrum of light. And so the notch code allows the technician or the photographer to tell what type of film has been used. So in this case, it's a FP4 film, and that's what those notch codes refer to.
Right. So you're drawing attention to the fact that there's a sort of physical touch element in the process.
Yeah, and like we were talking about at the beginning of this talk, when we were chatting about my writing process, the way I start is to think about photographic processes, the rituals of making analog photographs. And that is kind of evident in the photographic work I make. It's kind of, I have a subject, but it's always part of that subject is photography itself. I suppose trying to reflect on photography's history as well. Yeah.
As often with these things, you feel like you're sort of talking around a subject, but we haven't talked about the obvious thing, which is what the pictures are of and what the titles are. Mm-hmm. So could you say a little bit about that? I mean, there's some, we've had temple, we've had instrument, and we've had labyrinth. This sounds like some strangely mysterious thing is going on with these objects. Can you tell us what's going on with these titles and the relationship to the objects you're photographing?
Yeah, so first of all, with the objects, like I described the circumstances under which I was making the pictures, which it was lockdown. I had previously done, well, like a lot of photographers, I work a lot with and in and around different types of archives. So some of them are informal archives, like family albums, for instance. Some of them are formal archives, like museums, which are, inherently quite, can be quite problematic places. So I was kind of thinking about my own collection or archive of objects in the room that I was in. And those objects have been either found in and around my studio, or are things that kind of come when you are ordering things like boxes of paper or chemistry. You've got bubble wrap in them and slips of, strips of card. And so it was trying to kind of make a kind of grammar out of those objects, which are, pretty disparate. And don't necessarily have an immediate connection. So the way that they're connected together is A, through the aesthetics of the photograph, but B, through the titles. And the titles come from the Argentinian writer Borges. And remember, I talked about Citizen Kane, about the premise of Citizen Kane being the journalist is trying to make up a self-portrait of someone from all these little fragments of what people have been telling him. And just serendipitously, I came across this fragment of writing by Borges, which I think is worth reading out. Do you mind if I read it out?
Be my guest.
All right, so here it is. And it's from a wee book called Dream Tigers. So Borges writes, a man sets himself the task of portraying the world. Through the years, he peoples a space with images of provinces, kingdoms, mountains, bays, ships, islands, fishes, rooms, instruments, stars, horses, and people. Shortly before his death, he discovers that the patient labyrinth of lines traces the image of his face. So essentially, he's talking about, and this was, I think, near the end of his life. So he's talking about how so much of his work ends up being a self-portrait of sorts. And I think that's true of this work for me as well, in a way.
You're tacitly inviting me to ask you to explain what connection this broken bust has to your personal life.
Do you mean what's the yeah, okay, what's the actual story?
Well, it doesn't have to be the actual story, but I mean, if in a way these images are self-portrait as objects, do you think of it as in an explicit way, or do you think it's sort of it's there in the background, or is there a particular story with each object?
Yeah, well, I think it's there in the background. Some of the objects do have a particular story, or they represent something that I was thinking about or reading about that kind of, you know, like for us all, you know, you're out like living in the world and looking at things and receiving things all the time. And one of the like joys of making artwork of whatever kind, for me anyway, is kind of watching how those things that you take in are revealed in whatever it is that you're making. So yeah, I mean, like this object has a particular story that is, you know, related to when I was studying here. I broke it by accident. It's actually an artwork by another artist. But the reason I included it in Labyrinth is because it's clearly has the look of a monument, of a broken monument. And you know, like I think there's quite a lot of melancholy in these images as well, which relates again back to the time that they were being made. You know, it was a scary time, 2021. So there is something of that kind of like what's the right word? Yeah, there's like foreboding or something in the images. Yeah.
I mean, in each case, I think you're also. It's easy to find a connection between the word and the image. So temple is like a pyramid, and you can think, you know, it just physically resembles a temple. And this one, labyrinth, it's easy to think of, this is a depiction of the inside of someone's head, that it's like a mind is like a labyrinth. You're happy with those kinds of ways of going into the image?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, when I was selecting the final ones and naming them, I was kind of thinking it as both like of this kind of like fragmented self-portrait, but also like as a kind of invented cityscape as well, like the choosing the dark black velvet to shoot against. Kind of, I was thinking in my mind of it being this kind of, it could be a museum space, it could be a void, it could be that these objects are in drawers, which is where most museum objects are kept. And there's a kind of ambiguity with that, with both the, you know, the velvet backdrops and in the titles that I quite like I'm aiming to make work where there's enough room for interpretation, you know, for people to have their own interpretations of it.
The last one that we're going to show we chose to talk about this because I'd asked you whether this is a sort of slightly solipsistic process, that you're just talking about yourself, and you wanted to say that no, this also brings in the world, even if it's a very pared down vocabulary of images, and they're quite humble and personal, that it's not just about that. And you particularly referred to this picture.
Oh yeah, because like, you know, as is in the news now, and it was then and has been, you know, there was so many just tragic, brutal stories of people trying to find safety and sanctuary in this country, having to come across on small boats. And, you know, just when I made this image, that wasn't in the front of my mind when I made, this was one of the few that I reshot a few times, because I had put this cast of a hand that was in my studio from another project a long time ago. And when I looked at the first print of it, it resembled the sea, the ocean to me. And I kind of reshot it in mind with this like terrible sadness, you know, hearing about those stories and kind of reflecting on the kind of brutal government policies in response to it. So there's a kind of yeah, there's like, on some of them there are like political aspects kind of built into the work, that maybe I am the only one that knows the detail to that, but that's why this this image had that particular title, because that I mean, that was the impetus for going back and reshooting it in this very particular way, and printing it in this very particular way that resembles a kind of an ocean at night. Yeah,
and it shows how the mythic quality and tenor of the Borghese story is applicable to both the personal story and also to, like, the daily news is full of things that might equally be mythic elements.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks very much. If anybody wants to ask some questions now, we could open it up to people to ask questions. You can either do it by writing questions in the chat, or you could, I think there's some method of putting up a hand or something like that. But just if you're thinking about some questions that you want to ask Morwenna about her writing or about this work, then formulate them in your mind and write them down or raise your hand. Are you still working on this work, or has it reached its final state?
Yeah, no, I feel like I am still working on it. I'm actually, like, as part of another project, I'm working with a similar technique, but this time in color, and it's with people's objects, people that live in the area of Govan Hill. So that is that's like taking the kind of process and some of the aesthetics, but like having conversations with people about their specific life and their specific objects. So that's been really interesting. And Notch Code, yeah, is still, I'm still shooting them and still making them. And I hope I will forever. And when I kick the bucket, they'll just be, that can be my final self-portrait.
That's a gloomy prospect.
So
I don't know if anyone wants to ask Morwenna any questions, and then please write them in the thing or raise your hand. John has asked if there are any plans to exhibit the work.
Well, I mean, I'm lucky enough it's been, so Notch Code was exhibited a gallery in Edinburgh called Curfew, and it's in the couple who run the gallery, Debbie and Dan, it's in their house. So that was their first outing, but again, there was a lot of COVID around, so there was kind of kind of reduced amounts of people that could go. So that was like the first chance to see them on a wall and to think about them. And then Street Level Photo Works in Glasgow. They have an amazing open exhibition every year. So anybody can submit work. And they showed, I think there was 4 of them in that show. But my dream for Notch Code is, because we never really talked about it in detail, but they're obviously surrounded by this like inky black borders. And I've been experimenting with like printing them. They're still contact prints, but on much larger sheets of paper. And there's something really, that really works with them at that scale. So I would love to exhibit them again in the future.
We have a few questions coming in. So let's have a look. Tanya asks, I could just ask Tanya, would you like to ask the question? If you've gone to unmute yourself rather than me garbling it by repeating it.
I'm on a train, so I don't dare. Just read it out. It's grand, right? Thank you.
Okay. So Tanya asks, Morwenna, are you working at all on the relationship between photography and painting?
Well, I think like low key, probably. My mum is a painter, so I've been around that and like books on painting and stuff my whole life. So yeah, that like sinks in somewhere. But actually what I'm, my primary concern, or like not concern, my primary interest is in photography, and it's like technology, and it's like very complicated history, and because it's still so new, it's a fascinating medium to spend your life thinking about. So yeah, painting is always there. I think it's an influence on most other art forms, but I wouldn't say like explicitly,
I saw installation shots of the time you showed Notch Code, and there were other images that were of dust. Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah.
If I missed
you're right. You're right. They were resin casts of all the dust and hairs and the stuff that you can actually see on some of the prints. I had photographed through that using that same lighting technique. And yeah, there was a few other photographs in that show that related to like the way that the light moved. But actually, on reflection, I think Notch Code works at its best when it is just the still lives, actually.
Okay. Sama asks, in terms of writing, what's the relationship between the writing and the photography? The question is, how far can it go in terms of interdisciplinarity? I probably missaid that wrong. You've done other projects that have where the writing and the images are drawn together.
Yeah, I think it's just always been a part of my practice. So an example is when I graduated, so I studied at Napier in Edinburgh, and it was a photography and filmmaking course, and then you specialised in stills or filmmaking. I specialised in stills, and in my final year, what I exhibited was essentially text pieces. They were obituaries, and the point of them was like the obituaries. There was like a little mini short story inserted into the obituary, and they were supposed to act as a kind of catalyst to imagine the person or the situation I was describing. So I didn't actually exhibit proper photographs. And so right from the beginning, I've been thinking about that kind of like that back and forth between like different modes of describing, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, you also worked with design and posters.
Well, yes. So I have actually quite a bit. My partner's a graphic designer, so obviously he influences me quite a lot. And I think the last kind of poster show we did was with Street Level. Really recently, I was telling you about this project called Fawns, where I'm photographing people's objects, and that's a collaboration with the local newspaper. And we wanted to show that work out on the streets in Govan Hill, in the shops and cafes. So posters were the perfect way to kind of combine text and image together. And I think the posters just also got a fascinating history. And I think it's a great vehicle for showing photography.
Yeah. I have time for a couple more questions. Imogen, you have a question. Imogen Howarth, I wonder if you'd like to ask the question rather than me garbling it.
Hi, yes, can you hear me? I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Hi, Morwenna, thanks so much for that. It's really brilliant to hear about your practice. I just wondered how you arrived at this particular photographic process and mode of image making, and I guess whether you'd previously experimented with various different processes and kind of organically arrived at this particular process and medium, or did you discover large format quite early on in your practice?
Oh, thank you for the question. Nice to meet you. Yeah, so when I studied photography, we got the opportunity to use large format, and I remember thinking, oh, I definitely don't want to do that again. That was very difficult. And then when I graduated, obviously, like most people, I didn't have access to that kind of equipment, so shot a lot in 35mm. I also have been always really keen on like experimenting in the darkroom, experimenting with different ways of making images and printing. But one of my other big interests is in thinking about how the tools that we use as artists shape the kind of photographs that we make. And my partner, through an old studio he was at ages ago, a professional photographer came in who was obviously switching to digital and had said, I've got this 5.4 monorail, it's got all these amazing lenses, do you want it? And so him and his studio mate bought it, and then it was in our studio. So I basically took over it and started to use 5.4 in earnest, maybe about like 4 or 5 years ago. So actually not that long ago. And there's something about that tool, that 5.4 monorail, that just suits me so well. So one thing is, my particular camera is fused to a particular tripod, like the mechanism that you attach. So I can't actually go anywhere with it, which suits me fine because I love just being in the studio mainly. Also, you really have to take your time to make the image, suits me. And also the 5.4 is one of the few cameras that you are not interrupted by technology in any way. You're not putting it up to your face. You are looking at a ground glass screen. You're looking at your subject upside down and back to front, but you're looking straight through the camera at the subject. And there's something about that immediacy, that way of like communing with your subject, that I find really kind of endlessly fascinating. And I've just been slowly developing that process that I talked about earlier. One of the things I like to do if I'm stuck and I don't know what work I'm going to make next, I go to a photograph from the history of photography that I admire or I'm puzzled by, and I try and work out how it's made, sometimes through how, maybe the artist has described it, or maybe you can figure it out yourself. And by working through how a photograph is made, by trying to replicate it, which you never can, you learn so much about your medium and how you're kind of relating to it at that particular moment in time.
That's great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I think we should stop there because it's 8 o'clock and I have a very eager dog here who wants to be fed. So I'd like to thank Morwenna for a terrific introduction to her work. If you want to see more than we talked about and learn more about it, then have a look in the magazine. There's a great introduction by Francesca Butterfield in this issue, which I should also have mentioned earlier, which is a great way into the pictures as well. You can buy it in shops now, or you can get a copy via our website. Thank you all for coming. I look forward to seeing you at the next launch. Just to reiterate, if you want to submit to the Writers' Prize, following in the footsteps of the august people we've been hearing from this evening, or if you want to show us work, then find out about the portfolio review and come and show your work to my colleague John. Thank you, Morwenna, again, and we see you the next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Good night.